Alright, if all goes according to plan, this video should be going out on the 23rd of February, which means it is Emily Blunt's birthday, so I figured that would be the best time to do the last thing on her filmography that I need to talk about that has been released. And that would be the Henry VIII miniseries, which I looked for when I was doing this a couple years ago and couldn't find it, and then I finally found it for a somewhat hefty price on Blu-ray, despite the fact that it's a Spanish copy. But it's it starts in Spanish, but there's, if you just go in the audio settings, English is there. And this was the another miniseries that we're talking about after we talked about Empire, which I didn't own when I did the video on it a couple years ago. Which is also worth checking out, even if just because of her. She actually plays a really major character in it. Unlike here, which is about a 3-hour and 15-minute total miniseries between two parts that she's in for about the last 45 minutes of it. But like I talked about with the Strange Case of Sherlock Holmes and Arthur Conan Doyle, even though I kind of watch these old supporting roles of hers, just kind of waiting for her to show up, and those scenes being the most worthwhile ones, I still try to look for the good aspects in these and talk about them, the whole kind of product in general. It's also worth noting, while we're talking about her, waiting for her other new projects, this of all things I found on Blu-ray, but for some reason Wild Mountain Time only has a DVD release right now. I'm assuming it'll eventually get to that point, but maybe that's just a representation of how people felt about it, I guess. But as far as the Henry VIII thing goes, what's interesting is when you also look at some of the major behind-the-scenes credits, like the fact that Peter Morgan wrote it, who would go on to write, like The Queen and Frost Nixon and Rush, and, most appropriately, The Other Bowling Girl. And the director of this thing is Pete Travis, who would go on to direct Dredd, of all things, so, which is not really apparent when you watch the two things. But to go into it itself, there are certain, I guess I'll just say this right now to get it out of the way. I do know that this is often referred to as, like, Henry VIII, the soap opera version, and when you're talking about it taking liberties with history and hardly representing history at all, I don't really know much, if anything about that, but I will take everybody's word for it that this is not a documentary. So, and highly dramatized. So, with that in mind, I do really the only other version of Henry VIII that I'm really familiar with is the Charles Laughton version from 1933, which, interestingly enough, was a black comedy, more or less. And this one is super serious. Despite one of the taglines for it is "Heads will roll," which sounds pretty tongue-in-cheek, but no, this is a deathly serious adaptation, regardless of the liberties in history it may or may not take. But when you first go into it, the first thing you will notice is the fact that Ray Winstone is the star, and that seems like I said, not only knowing so much about the whole Henry VIII story, just based on a tiny bit of history that I know and some of the previous adaptations, which may or may not be as faithful to history as this is, I have no idea. Ray Winstone seems like a pretty perfect casting choice. Like, you just hear that and you're like, yeah, that's about right. And like nobody, and it is to my understanding that like the Charles Laughton movie was kind of a big factor in other adaptations that followed it. Like a lot of people kind of, instead of looking at actual history, looked at the Charles Laughton movie, and that's kind of what's you can see that sort of portrayal, I guess you could say, where he's like kind of, it was the whole thing where he did eventually get obese over time, as his like health deteriorated by the time he was in his 50s. But these adaptations kind of like play him up as like he was constantly like really big and like oafish and stuff like that. Um, and you can say that nobody can play big and angry quite like Ray Winston, especially if you look at something like Nil by Mouth, or it kind of gives you the idea of how much he must have learned from Kingsley on Sexy Beast, watching that performance happen in front of him. Um, but obviously, the first thing we kind of really get into here, um, after the first of a number of Catherines, we have the first of more than one Anne, being Anne Boleyn, who is played here by a very charming Helena Bonham Carter. And what's interesting about this portion of the story is the way it plays up like basically like a romance story, like how a lot of people have compared this adaptation to like a soap opera. And yeah, but the thing is that I think a lot of what Carter brings to this is how it's like these scenes can almost convince you that suddenly you're in like a light romance story, despite the really dark territory we're going to go down. Like I said, this is a story, or this is a series that's one of the taglines is Seth will roll, which apparently is not supposed to be taken tongue in cheek when you look at the tone. But it's the way they play it up, like when he rides down the beach to get to her. It plays up like something right out of a storybook or something, like a storybook romance. And then we have the scene where they dance together that looks right out of Beauty and the Beast. Which it reminds me so much of Beauty and the Beast. I almost feel like it had to have been intentional a little bit, especially with, the connotations of that. But we do get to the darkness of it really quickly. And I do think it's appropriately jarring. Like, it might sound like all the tones all over the place, but I actually think there's some kind of decent effect here to the jarring nature of setting it up to be so almost look like it's storybook romance, to ultimately be what it ends up being. And that contrast kind of really brings something out. Even though we do get the vibe already of the kind of character he is and is going to be, it might already feel out of place when the romance here with Anne Boleyn starts, but I still think that contrast has something going for it. But yeah, when we get to the darkness of it and, like the rape scene and stuff like that. But I do think another thing that Carter did really well here, and the most famous scenes from this thing, obviously, are the execution scenes, which obviously, there are many of. But the way they handle it, like at the beginning, the first one we see is Charles Dance. And yeah, it is worth noting that like his name's on the cover here and everything, and Charles Dance is in this for like 10 minutes, like the first 10 minutes. But being Charles Dance, it's like you could just give him 10 seconds and he would make it all worthwhile, because Charles Dance is amazing. But they do kind of start off with, and it might seem a bit sort of, I don't know what you'd call it. You can't really say over the top because it's a public execution by beheading, but the way they kind of show the barbaric nature of it, because usually when you see like these kind of executions in movies, it's like sometimes you'll see the execution, sometimes it'll be off screen and you'll just see the crowd react and maybe cheer weirdly or something. But what we see here is really kind of showing the barbaric nature, where when Charles Dance is beheaded, some of the people in the front row are like splashed with blood, and that happens also. Like I think it's Cromwell later that has the execution go horribly wrong, which is a really disturbing scene, and it kind of evokes memories of like Michael Jeter's execution gone wrong in The Green Mile. Where it's like the more they go for it, just the worse it gets, and it's a really hard to watch scene, in an effective way. But when we get to Anne Boleyn's execution, and the way she's just being so sort of stoic about it, and the way she sort of accepted it, and she kind of has this pale look to her, like just kind of looking at her, you can tell that she knows what's about, like, she's very aware of what's about to happen, but yet she's talking about it as if she's getting ready for, like, any other task. And it's this really kind of surreal and it's kind of terrifying moment leading up to that. And I do think the way it handles that stuff is pretty well done. And like I said, as far as being like sort of terrifying and barbaric about itself, and kind of really setting the tone for that, and not just kind of glossing over it off screen. Like we get all the build up to it and everything. So there's that. And as far as like other cast members, we have David Suchet is hanging out in here, and we talked about Blunt in Death on the Nile from the Poirot show that Suchet plays him. So this is kind of them, or maybe that's them reuniting. I think this was one of the first things she ever did. I think so. Death on the Nile would have been after, but either way, they eventually reunited. And when part 2 comes around, the second episode comes around, we get Sean Bean. That has kind of an interesting storyline going on here. That's kind of basically kind of the first half of the second half of the whole series. Another person that comes in here as Mary Tudor is Laura Belmont, and she has a character that I kind of probably could have had a bit more focus, but at the same time, it's like, if you've seen The War Zone, seeing Ray Winstone and Laura Belmont together might still turn your stomach, especially in that moment here where he kind of creeps on her a bit, briefly. But obviously, the main thing I really want to talk about here is when we get to the point of Blonde coming in, and the way she's brought in is through Mark Strong, and Mark Strong is obviously a presence throughout this whole thing, and now we get to this point where he's kind of trying to work himself into the royalty by bringing Blunt into this, and I guess it's just we just go right into the first scene that she has, and the thing about this is that thinking about the fact that it was this early in her career, because I think this was, when I say this had to have been one of the first things she did, I think it was just Boudica Warrior Queen may have been the only thing before it. Maybe her episode of Foyle's War. But like the IMDb list and the Wikipedia list have these in a different order, so I'm not really sure what came first, but obviously this was at the very beginning, the year before My Summer of Love, which she seems to officially call her first movie. And the thing about this being so early in her career, and this being her opening scene, like her first scene, I think it's worth addressing that some people... You often hear the thing about actresses doing nude scenes, being brave for doing so. And then some people like to counter that by saying that they don't consider it that because ultimately the actress has chosen to do the role that requires the nude scene. But in this particular case especially, I definitely think there is a sort of courageousness to the fact that of this scene, because like I said, it's still, she hardly had any screen experience whatsoever. Like I said, one throwaway TV movie and maybe one episode of another show, and then this, and it's not necessarily just that it's a nude scene, but it's definitely the context of it also, where Mark Strong is inspecting her, and it's just really uncomfortable, and knowing their relation adds another layer to that already. Because, and the reason I say this is that one of the things that I guess really the thing that I just really, really admire about Blunt in general is that she almost seems to have made an entire career out of going out of her comfort zone, where it's like she was terrified to speak, much like myself, and she just decided that acting was the way to get out of that, and singing was the way to get out of that, and stuff like that. And to basically make everything out of facing your fears. There was the whole thing where she has a real problem with heights, yet the Kite scene in Mary Poppins Returns was much more practical than it might seem. Um, and yeah, and in stage, she has stage fright. She was 18 when she did a play with Judi Dench, and she does musicals nearly regularly, it seems. Um, and like I said, just throw this on top of that. It's like almost everything she does seems to be conquering some sort of fear. And it's like Emily Blunt is a more brave person than I will ever be. And I feel like this is a prime example of that, of this being one of your first screen appearances. And the very first scene is a scene that is this uncomfortable and confronting, is just really admirable to me. So, continuing on, we have just the charm that she brings. Like I talked about that in Wild Mountain Time and the Strange Case of Sherlock Holmes and Arthur Conan Doyle just very recently, about just the really effortless charm that she brings to it, and that kind of comes through in this card game, where she's kind of helping him like cheat a little bit. But like she went, it's like it kind of speaks for her presence in general in any movie. That in this card game scene, she just quickly it's like she's won over everybody in the room. Like she's charmed everybody in the room. Um, and then there are some scenes where she gets to show off emotion. Like I said, I feel like there's hardly anybody that shows off getting emotional and crying as authentically as she does. Even in like the earliest parts of her career, she was already pulling that off. And what's interesting about the scenes here is when she gets really emotional when he proposes to her, and then she gets really emotional again when he basically forgives her for not going to the marriage bed of virgin. Um, but then the whole thing is that she's promiscuous, so like she's crying in his arms because he's forgiven her for that. But then in the very next scene is the bath scene when she's practically seducing Culpepper by that point. And then so it's kind of like a double thing here, to where you look at the emotion and you think that it looks so authentic and so real, like she's genuinely moved, and shocked that he would propose to her, and then moved and shocked again that he forgives her. Um, but when you see the character, it's like that doesn't really add up. That's how she would feel. So then you realize all the underlying things here, and the fact that she knows what she's getting into, and it's like these emotion and these tears, probably even more so, are fear for her life. But the fact that it kind of feels like it could be both things, is pretty remarkable acting. So, and not to mention, like I talk about, just like even when she doesn't necessarily have lines, but just her presence says something. Like the fact that, like the scene where she's on the swing, and she just literally looks like a living painting. And the way he's like falling for her in the movie, because they established before Catherine Howard comes into the story, like that he's starting to reach the peak of his coldness, like right before Catherine Howard comes into it, when the other Anne comes in, and he's just like he's like shunning her completely, and there's that great scene that Winstone has where we see the sort of drastic back and forth he can have, where he's like joking around with everybody at the banquet table, and then they say like you need to go to your marriage bed, and she's waiting, and then he just turns so quickly and becomes like kind of terrifying. And it's setting that up, and then once he meets Catherine Howard, the way he's just so completely smitten by her, it's like I feel like in any other case, it would be kind of jarring and be like like his character is kind of beyond this, but it's so the charm that she brings and the way she wins over a room, it feels so believable, that's how strong his attraction would be, and how much it would change like the coldness his character had up to that point, and how it's like it's kind of warmed him over again, if briefly. But even briefly, normally you would think it would be harder to buy, but it just you just totally believe that he would feel that way. So, but yes, then you have the bath scene as well, when she is basically seducing Culpepper, and it is the case where you talk about all the different things you can bring to a performance. She's brought the emotion, she's brought the charm, she's brought just the general presence, she brought the balls to do the first scene. So now you have the bath scene, and then there's the thing where she has to be, genuinely seductive. And it's when she says that line to Culpepper, "Look at me when I talk to you." It's the scene in The Wolf of Wall Street when DiCaprio is talking to Rob Reiner about Margot Robbie, and he does the thing where he bites his fist. I assume that's what I look like watching the bath scene. So that's, yeah. In case you needed to know that, that's what I'm saying is the scene is effective, and like I said, it's just yet another facet of this performance that just completely and totally works. Um, but is there anything else before we get to the big scene? That might be it. So the big scene obviously would have to be her execution, and I do remember hearing that as far as like history goes, that when Catherine Howard was executed, it was much more like the way we saw with Anne Boleyn, with Helena Carter in the first part, where she just did it very sort of stoically and just did it almost like it was inevitable. So she just took it as it was, and it wasn't the big emotional moment that this is portrayed as. But so to separate it from history and look at it as a piece of acting, this is harrowing. Like this scene is so hard to watch, where it's just deeply upsetting and terrifying because, like I've always said with all the other movies of hers we've talked about, when she brings emotion to something, it is always so authentic and sometimes uncomfortably authentic. And this scene when she's just basically begging for her life while she's on the chopping block, is just so chilling and so incredibly effective. And like I said, it's something that haunts me, this scene. So like I guess even if it's not historically accurate or anything like that, just as a piece of acting, it's just insane. It's yeah. So that pretty much more or less takes us to the end. Like it's almost like the story wisely says, well, if we're done with Blunt, we don't really. There's not much else we can offer. But yeah, he did have, what was it, one more wife after this, and we basically just kind of start getting a sort of an epilogue of where everybody ended up, and he gets his Michael Corleone death. And yeah, so as far as like a whole thing, the production values are obviously really great, as they often are. And like I said, it's British productions seem to have like much more sort of going on as far as how it feels like they really go all out, and it feels really authentic and like it's from a time that's very, very far away from the present, by like centuries. And doesn't feel like they're on sets or like they're actors dressing up. The costumes are really stand out, but like I said, really feel like we're actually in a place rather than just it being a TV movie or a miniseries or whatever you want to call it. And like I said, Ray Winstone is a perfect casting choice, I think anyway, and his performance does what it needs to, depending on what you're looking for in a performance of this character or historical figure. So, yeah, but obviously at the end of the day, I'm just here to talk about Blunt. That's all I want to do. So, but that's the whole thing in a nutshell. But yes, as to be expected, it's mainly worth watching for the last 40 to 45 minutes or so, which is the only portion that she's in. So, I guess that's going to be it for this until we start getting the new stuff. I know A Quiet Place 2 does have a release date now, so it's September 17th or 14th, it's somewhere in there. The only reason it's not solidified in my head is we're still at a time where I'm not exactly solidifying any dates. But I hope that we can, and obviously, hopefully, we can finally see Jungle Cruise. I'm still wondering if Jungle Cruise even technically exists or not, or if Disney just made a couple of fake trailers for a movie that doesn't exist that we are never going to see. I don't know. But but it would be great too. And as when I talked about Wild Mountain Time, I wasn't sure about where the English was. And then when she was doing Graham Norton, she talked about how she was like already preparing like the whole horse riding thing to do it. So I think she said they were started shooting like maybe last month or something. And then when Krasinski hosted SNL, he said she was in the UK. So I'm assuming that's where it's being shot. That would make sense given the title. So, I wasn't sure if it was a series or what it was. Apparently, it's a miniseries. So she might have said like 6 episodes or something. So that'll be interesting to see her go back into miniseries territory after this and Empire. Now she's in this late in her career, and TV's kind of where all the cool kids are hanging out. So yeah, and then like I said, we got Ball and Chain happening, and I stand by that maybe she shouldn't do the MCU thing in favor of more interesting projects that won't eat up all of her schedule. But I guess we'll see what happens with that development as well. So we'll see, or if it's a development. And is that it? We talked about the Not Fade Away thing, but like I said, that seems to be very up in the air. So yeah, seems like there's plenty to look forward to in her future. It's just a matter of when these things are going to come out, I guess. So yes, so hopefully we will be back talking about her very soon. So because that's like one of my favorite things to do. So until then, I think that's it.